Yay! I'm going to start reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I love you. Happy holiday. And we can begin. Chapter 1. Lucy looks into a wardrobe. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This is a story about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready, and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they did not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair, which grew over most of his face, as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said good night to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room, and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet, and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There'll be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out the window you could see neither the mountains, nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. "Of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them, a long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in another. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1 it'll clear up in an hour or so, and in the meantime we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected that they would, but soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor, and after that was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner, and then came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then kind of little stair halls, and a door that led out onto a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books, most of them very old books, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after that they looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking-glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all, except a dead blue bottle on the window-sill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again. All except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hung up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew it was very foolish to shut oneself up into any wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her, so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps away, always expecting to feel woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. This must be a simply enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed there was something crunching under her feet. I wonder if is that more mothballs, she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. This is very queer, she said, and went a step or 2 further. Next moment she found that she was rubbing her face and hands. What she was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, it's just like the branches of a tree," exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later she found she was standing in the middle of a wood at night time, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there between the dark tree trunks she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe, and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had of course left the door open, for she knew it was a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. I can always get back if anything goes wrong, thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the woods toward the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it and found it was a lamp-post. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamp-post in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming towards her, and soon after that a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamp-post. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upwards he looked like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet he had goat's hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice it at first because it nearly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there were stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella, and the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked just as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the fawn. Chapter 2. What Lucy Found There. "Good evening," said Lucy, but the fawn was so busy picking up its parcels that at first it did not reply. When it had finished it made her a little bow. Good evening," said the fawn. "Excuse me, I don't want to be inquisitive, but should I be right thinking that you are a daughter of Eve?" "My name's Lucy," she said, not quite understanding him. "But forgive me, you are what they call a girl?" said the fawn. "Of course I'm a girl," said Lucy. "You are, in fact, human?" "Of course I'm human," said Lucy, still a little puzzled. To be sure," said the fawn. "How stupid of me. But I've never seen a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve before. I am delighted, that is to say," and then it stopped as if it had been going to say something it had not intended but remembered it in time. Delighted, it went on. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tumnus." "I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "And may I ask, Lucy, daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "how have you come into Narnia?" "Narnia? What's that?" said Lucy. "This is the land of Narnia," said the fawn, "where we are now, all that lies between the lamp-post and the great castle of Caerphilly on the eastern sea. And you have come from the wild woods of the west?" I got in through the wardrobe in the spare room," said Lucy. "Ah," said Mr. Tumnus, in a rather melancholy voice. "If only I had worked harder at geography when I was a little fawn, I should no doubt know about all these strange countries. It is too late now." "But they aren't countries at all," said Lucy, almost laughing. "It's only just back there. At least, I'm not sure. It is summer there." "Meanwhile," said Mr. Tumnus, "it is winter in Narnia, and has been for ever so long. And we shall both catch cold if we stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve from the far land of the spare room where eternal summer reigns in the bright city of wardrobe, how would it be if you came and had tea with me?" "Thank you very much," said Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, "but I was wondering whether I ought to be getting back." "It's only just round the corner," said the Fawn, "and there'll be a roaring fire and toast and sardines and cake." "Well, it's very kind of you," said Lucy, "but I shan't be able to stay long." "If you will take my arm, Daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "I shall be able to hold the umbrella over both of us. That's the way. Now off we go." And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood, arm in arm with this strange creature, as if they had known one another all their lives. They had not gone far before they came to a place where the ground became rough, and there were rocks all about, and little hills up and little hills down. At the bottom of one small valley, Mr. Tumnus turned suddenly aside as if he were going to walk straight into an unusually large rock. But at the last moment, Lucy found he was leading her into the entrance of a cave. As soon as they were inside, she found herself blinking in the light of a wood fire. Then Mr. Tumnus stooped and took a flaming piece of wood out of the fire with a neat little pair of tongs and lit a lamp. "Now we shan't be long," he said, and immediately put a kettle on. Lucy thought she had never been in a nicer place. It was a little, dry, clean cave of fresh, reddish stone, with a carpet on the floor and two little chairs. "One for me and one for a friend," said Mr. Tumnus, "and a table and a dresser and a mantelpiece over the fire, and above that a picture of an old fawn with a grey beard." In one corner there was a door which Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on one wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at these while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like "The Life and Letters of Silnius, or Nymphus and Their Ways of Men," "Monks and Gamekeepers, a Study in Popular Legends, or Is Man a Myth?" "Now, Daughter of Eve," said the Fawn. And really it was a wonderful tea. There was a nice brown egg, lightly boiled for each of them, then sardines on toast, and then buttered toast, and then toast with honey, and then sugar-topped cake. And when Lucy was tired of eating, the Fawn began to talk. He had wonderful tales to tell of life in the forest. He told about the midnight dances, and how the nymphs who lived in the wells and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fawns. About long hunting parties after the milk-white stag who could give you wishes if you caught him. About feasting and treasure-seeking with the wild red dwarfs in deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor. And then about summer, when the woods were green, and old Silnius on his fat donkey would come to visit them, and sometimes Bacchus himself. And then the streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would give itself up to jollifications for weeks to end. "Not that it isn't always winter now," he said gloomily. Then, to cheer himself up, he took out from his case on the dresser a strange little flute that looked as if it were made of straw, and began to play. And the tune he played made Lucy want to cry and laugh and dance and go to sleep all at the same time. It must have been hours later when she shook herself and said, "Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I'm sorry to stop you, and I do love that tune, but really I must go home. I only meant to stay for a few minutes." "Oh, it's no good now, you know," said the Fawn, laying down his flute and shaking his head at her very sorrowfully. "No good?" said Lucy, jumping up, feeling rather frightened. "What do you mean? I've got to go home at once. The others will be wondering what has happened to me." But a moment later she asked, "Mr. Tumnus, whatever is the matter?" For the Fawn's brown eyes had filled with tears, and the tears began trickling down its cheeks, and soon they were running off the end of its nose, and at last it covered its face with its hands and began to howl. "Mr. Tumnus, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy in great distress. Don't, what's the matter? Aren't you well? Dear Mr. Tumnus, do tell me what is wrong." But the Fawn continued sobbing as if his heart would break, and even when Lucy went over and put her arms round him and lent him her handkerchief, he still did not stop. He merely took the handkerchief and kept on using it, wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet to be of any more use, so that presently Lucy was standing in a damp patch. "Mr. Tumnus," bawled Lucy in his ear, shaking him, "do stop at once. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a great big fawn like you. What on earth are you crying about?" Oh, sobbed Mr. Tumnus. I'm crying because I'm such a bad fawn. I don't think you're a bad fawn at all, said Lucy. I think you're a very good fawn. You are the nicest fawn I've ever met. You wouldn't say that if you knew, replied Mr. Tumnus between sobs. No, I'm a bad fawn. I don't suppose there ever was a worse fawn since the beginning of the world. But what have you done? Asked Lucy. My old father, now, said Mr. Tumnus. That's his picture over on the mantelpiece. He would never have done a thing like this. A thing like what? Said Lucy. Like what I've done, said the fawn. Taken service under the White Witch. That's what I am. I'm in the pay of the White Witch. A White Witch? Who is she? Why, it is she that has got all Narnia under her thumb. It's she that makes it always winter, and never Christmas. Think of that. Oh, how awful, said Lucy. But what does she pay you for? That's the worst of it, said Mr. Tumnus with a deep groan. I'm a kidnapper for her. That's what I am. Look at me, daughter of Eve. Would you believe that I'm the sort of fawn to meet a poor innocent child in the wood, one that had never done me any harm, and pretend to be friendly with it and invite it home to my cave, all for the sake of lulling it to sleep, then handing it over to the White Witch? No, said Lucy. I'm sure you wouldn't do anything of the sort. But I have, said the fawn. Well, said Lucy, rather slowly, for she wanted to be truthful and yet not too hard on him. Well, that was pretty bad. But you're so sorry for it. I'm sure you'll never do it again. Daughter of Eve, don't you understand, said the fawn. It isn't something I have done. I'm doing it now, this moment. What do you mean? Cried Lucy, turning very white. You are the child, said Tumnus. I had orders from the White Witch that if I ever saw a son of Adam or daughter of Eve in the wood, I would catch them and hand them over to her. And you are the first I've ever met. And I've pretended to be your friend and asked you to tea, and all the time I've been meaning to take you, to wait till you were asleep and then go and tell her. Oh, but you won't, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. You won't, will you? Indeed, you really mustn't. And if I don't, he said, beginning to cry again, she's sure to find out, and she'll have my tail cut off and my horn sawn off, and my beard plucked out, and she'll wave her wand over my beautiful clove hoofs and turn them into horrid solid hoofs like wretched horses. And if she's extra and specially angry, she'll turn me into stone, and I shall only be the statue of a fawn in her horrible house until the 4 thrones at Cair Paravel are filled, and goodness knows when that will happen, or whether it will ever happen at all. I'm very sorry, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, but please let me go home. Of course I will, said the fawn. Of course I've got to. I see that now. I hadn't known what humans were like before I met you. Of course I can't give you up to the witch. Not now that I know you, but we must be off at once. I'll see you back to the lamppost. I suppose you can find your own way back to the spare room and wardrobe? I'm sure I can, said Lucy. We must go as quietly as we can, said Mr. Tumnus. The whole world is full of her spies. Whole wood is full of her spies. Even some of the trees are on her side. They both got up and left their tea things on the table. Mr. Tumnus once more put up his umbrella and gave Lucy his arm, and they went out in the snow. Their journey back was not at all like the journey to the fawn's cave. They stole along as quickly as they could without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the darkest places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamp-post again. Do you know your way from here, daughter of Eve? Said Tumnus. Lucy looked very hard between the trees and could just see in the distance a patch of light that looked like daylight. Yes, she said, I can see the wardrobe door. Then be off home as quick as you can, said the fawn. And can you forgive me for what I meant to do? Why, of course I can, said Lucy, shaking him heartily by the hand, and I do hope that you won't get into dreadful trouble on my account. Farewell, daughter of Eve, said he. Perhaps I may keep your handkerchief? Rather, said Lucy, and then ran off towards the far patch of daylight as quickly as her legs would carry her. And presently, instead of rough branch brushing past her, she felt coats, and instead of crunching snow under her feet, she felt wooden board. And all at once she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe and into the same empty room from which the whole adventure had started. She shut the wardrobe door tightly behind her and looked around, panting for breath. It was still raining, and she could hear the voices of the others in the passage. I'm here, she shouted. I'm here. I've come back. I'm all right. Chapter 3. Edmund in the Wardrobe. Lucy ran out of the empty room into the passage and found the other 3. It's all right, she repeated. I've come back. What on earth are you talking about, Lucy? Asked Susan. Why, said Lucy in amazement. "Haven't you all been wondering where I was?" "So you've been hiding, have you?" said Peter. "Poor old Lou, hiding and nobody noticed. You'll have to hide longer than that if you want people to start looking for you." "But I've been away for hours and hours," said Lucy. The others all stared at one another. "Batty," said Edmund, tapping his head. "Quite batty." "What do you mean, Lou?" asked Peter. What what I said," answered Lucy. "It was just after breakfast when I went into the wardrobe, and I've been away for hours and hours, and had tea, and all sorts of things have happened." "Don't be silly, Lucy," said Susan. "We've only just come out of that room a moment ago." "And you were there then?" "She's not being silly at all," said Peter. "She's just making up a story for fun, aren't you, Lou?" "And why shouldn't she?" "No, Peter, I'm not. She said, it's a magic wardrobe, there's a wood inside it, and it's snowing, and there's a faun and a witch, and it's called Narnia, come and see." The others didn't know what to think, but Lucy was so excited that they all went back in with her into the room. She rushed ahead of them, flung open the door of the wardrobe, and cried, "Now, go in and see for yourselves." "Why, you goose," said Susan, putting her head inside and pulling the fur coats apart. "It's just an ordinary wardrobe. Look, there's the back of it." Then everyone looked in and pulled the coats apart, and they all saw, Lucy herself saw, a perfectly ordinary wardrobe. There was no wood and no snow, only the back of the wardrobe with hooks on it. Peter went in and rapped his knuckles on it to make sure that it was solid. "A jolly good hoax, Lou," he said, and he came out again. "You have really taken us in, I must admit. We half believed you." "But it wasn't a hoax at all," said Lucy. "Really, truly, it was all different a moment ago. Honestly, it was. I promise." "Come, Lou," said Peter. "That's going a bit far. You've had your joke. Hadn't you better drop it now?" Lucy grew very red in the face and tried to say something, though she hardly knew what she was trying to say, and then burst into tears. For the next few days she was very miserable. She could have made it up with the others quite easily at any time, if she could have brought herself to say the whole thing was only a story she made up for fun. But Lucy was a very truthful girl, and she knew that she was really in the right, and she could not bring herself to say this. The others, who thought she was telling a lie, and a silly lie too, made her very unhappy. The two elder ones did this without meaning to do it, but Edmund could be spiteful, and on this occasion he was spiteful. He sneered and jeered at Lucy and kept on asking if she'd found any other new countries and other cupboards all over the house. What made it worse was that these days ought to have been delightful. The weather was fine, and they were outdoors from morning to night, bathing, fishing, climbing trees, lying in the heather. But Lucy could not properly enjoy any of it, and so things went on until the next day. That day, when it came to the afternoon and there was still no sign of a break in the weather, they decided to play hide and seek. Susan was in, and as soon as the others scattered to hide, Lucy went into the room where the wardrobe was. She did not mean to hide in the wardrobe because she knew that would only set the others talking again, and the whole wretched business. But she did want to have one more look inside, for by this time she was beginning to wonder herself whether Narnia and the faun had not been a dream. The house was so large and complicated and full of hiding places that she thought she would have time to have one look in the wardrobe and then hide somewhere else. But as soon as she reached it, she heard steps in the passages outside, and then there was nothing for it but to jump into the wardrobe and hold the door closed behind her. She did not shut it properly because she knew it was very silly to shut oneself into a wardrobe, even if it's not a magic one. Now the steps she heard were those of Edmund, and he came into the room just in time to see Lucy vanishing into the wardrobe. He at once decided to get into it himself, not because he thought it a particularly good place to hide, but because he wanted to go on teasing her about her imaginary country. He opened the door. There were the coats hanging up as usual, and a smell of mothballs and darkness and silence, and no sign of Lucy. "She thinks I'm Susan come to catch her," said Edmund to himself, "so she's keeping very quiet in the back." He jumped in and shut the door, forgetting what a very foolish thing this is to do. Then he began feeling for Lucy in the dark. He expected to find her in a few seconds, and was very surprised when he did not. He decided to open the door again and let in some light, but he could not find the door either. He didn't like this at all, and began groping wildly in every direction. He even shouted out, "Lucy! Lou! Where are you? I know you're here." There was no answer, and Edmund noticed that his own voice had a curious sound, not the sound you expect in a cupboard, but a kind of open-air sound. He also noticed that he was unexpectedly cold, and then he saw a light. Thank goodness, said Edmund. The door must have swung open on its own. He forgot all about Lucy and went toward the light, which he thought was the open door of the wardrobe. But instead of finding himself stepping out into the spare room, he found himself stepping out from the shadow of some thick, dark fir trees into an open place in the middle of a wood. There was a crisp, dry snow under his feet, and more snow lying on the branches of the trees. Overhead there was pale blue sky, the sort of sky one sees in a fine winter day in the morning. Straight ahead of him he saw between the tree trunks the sun, just rising, very red and clear. Everything was perfectly still, as if he were the only living creature in that country. There was not even a robin or a squirrel among the trees, and the wood stretched as far as he could see in every direction. He shivered. He now remembered that he had been looking for Lucy, and also how unpleasant he had been about her imaginary country, which now turned out to not be imaginary at all. He thought she must be somewhere quite close, and so he shouted, "Lucy! Lucy! I'm here too! Edmund!" There was no answer. "She's angry about all the things I've been saying lately," thought Edmund, and though he did not like to admit he had been wrong, he also did not like being alone in this strange, cold, quiet place, so he shouted again, "I say, Lou, I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I see now you were right all along. Do come out. Make it, Pax." Still there was no answer. "Just like a girl," said Edmund to himself, "sulking somewhere and won't accept an apology." He looked round him again and decided he did not much like this place, and had almost made up his mind to go home when he heard very far off in the wood a sound of bells. He listened, and the sound came nearer and nearer, and at last there swept into sight a sled drawn by 2 reindeer. The reindeer were about the size of Shetland ponies, and their hairs were so white that even the snow hardly looked white compared to them. Their branching horns were gilded and shone like something on fire when the sunrise caught them. Their harness was of scarlet leather and covered with bells. On the sled driving the reindeer sat a fat dwarf who would have been about 3 feet high if he had been standing. He was dressed in polar bear's fur, and on his head he wore a red hood with long gold tassels hanging down from it at its point. His huge beard covered his knees and served him instead of a rug. But behind him, on a much higher seat in the middle of the sled, sat a very different person, a great lady. And I'm going to pause us right there, ladies.